The city that still believed. An ordinary evening in an extraordinary city. Rome softened into evening the way it always had, as if the city were too ancient to be surprised by the turning of the day. The light withdrew slowly from marble and brick. Shadows lengthened along columns that had stood through emperors, fires, triumphs, and quiet years no one bothered to name. The streets did not empty at once. They thinned in stages, as though the city preferred gradual endings, an unhurried retreat into night that felt less like surrender and more like routine. Vendors closed their stalls with practiced motions. Wooden shutters slid into place. Cloth awnings were folded, tied, and lifted away from the evening air. The last coins of the day were counted under dimming light, fingers moving out of habit, not urgency. A few late customers argued gently over prices that no longer mattered. Others drifted past, carrying bread wrapped in cloth, bundles of greens, cheap oil, and small comforts meant to make night feel ordinary. The smell of smoke rose from countless hearths, not a single plume thick enough to alarm, but a steady presence, thin, familiar, domestic. It clung to the lower streets and climbed slowly, dissolving into the cooling sky. Rome smelled like itself, ash from cooking fires, damp stone, river air, old wood, sweat, and incense lingering from earlier prayers. Somewhere water moved through the city. Fountains continued their quiet work, spilling into basins worn smooth by hands that had drawn from them for generations. In courtyards, buckets were filled and carried indoors. In narrow alleys, runoff traced thin lines along uneven stones. Rome's life was not one grand motion, but thousands of small functions continuing without instruction. From higher ground, the city looked peaceful. A scattering of light-oil lamps and torches flickered as dusk deepened. Roof lines layered into the distance. Temple facades and civic buildings held on to the last pale glow of day. Farther off, the dark curve of the Tiber cut through the city like a vein, reflecting only what little light remained. No single sound defined the evening. It was a weave. Footsteps, occasional laughter, the clang of a closing gate, the low voices of men lingering too long at a corner, the brief cry of a vendor who refused to be the first to surrender. There were no trumpets, no proclamations, no urgent riders cutting through crowds. The city did not feel watched. It did not feel threatened. It felt tired in the normal way cities grow tired after a day of living. And yet Rome was not an ordinary city. Even in decline, though many refused that word, it still carried the weight of its own name. People moved through its streets as though the stones themselves guaranteed permanence. Rome had endured invasions before. It had endured civil wars, assassinations, famine, plague. The city's identity had been forged in surviving what should have ended it. That belief lingered everywhere. In the way doors were barred with calm rather than fear. In the way families spoke of tomorrow as if tomorrow belonged to them. In the way old men sat on steps and told stories that made the past feel like proof of the future. The empire's center had shifted long ago. Power had drifted away in stages, like smoke, first subtle, then undeniable. Courtiers, councils, and armies no longer moved according to Rome's gravity alone, but the city remained convinced that its name still mattered more than the truth of its position. That evening, as lamps were lit and voices lowered, Rome behaved like a city protected by its own legend. People went to sleep expecting continuity. They expected the same streets in the morning, the same routines, the same assumptions. They expected that if danger existed, it would announce itself loudly enough to be believed. Rome did not yet understand that some endings arrive without sound. and that the most important change is often the one that allows the city to fall asleep as usual. The weight of being eternal. Rome had been called eternal for so long that the word no longer sounded like praise. It sounded like fact. The idea of eternity did not live in proclamations or inscriptions anymore. It lived in posture, in the way people spoke of the city without urgency, in the way danger, when mentioned at all, was framed as temporary, another test, another chapter, another moment Rome would absorb and survive. Children grew up hearing that Rome had always been here, not as a lesson, but as an assumption. The city's presence shaped their understanding of time itself. Events happened in Rome. Years passed around Rome. Even when emperors fell and borders shifted, the city remained the fixed point against which all movement was measured. This belief carried weight. It pressed gently but constantly on the lives of those who lived within the walls. It discouraged panic. It softened fear. It taught patience in the face of uncertainty. Why rush to prepare for an end that had never come? Rome had seen enemies before. Gauls, rebels, rival Romans. Each had entered the city's memory as proof of endurance rather than warning. Even destruction had been reframed as renewal. Fires rebuilt, temples restored, names changed, but the city persisted. Survival had become identity. That identity replaced vigilance. When news arrived from beyond the walls, it was filtered through expectation. Reports of unrest, of movement, of pressure along distant roads were acknowledged but not internalized. Rome had learned to believe that threats grew smaller as they approached, dissolved by the city's gravity. People trusted the past to manage the future. The weight of memory was heavier than the weight of evidence. What had always been safe felt safer than what was visibly changing. Rome's long history became a shield not against swords, but against imagination. Even the absence of authority did not alarm the city as it should have. There was no single voice guiding Rome anymore. No unquestioned command. Decisions arrived slowly, unevenly, sometimes not at all. Yet the city adapted to this silence without protest. It mistook endurance for stability. The walls still stood. The gates still closed at night. The forum still echoed with voices by day. The rituals of governance continued, even if their outcomes mattered less than they once had. On the surface, Rome functioned. And so people believed. They believed that a city which had outlasted centuries could outlast another season of uncertainty. They believed that whatever approach would be forced to accommodate Rome, not the other way around. This belief was not foolish. It was inherited. It had been passed down through generations who had never known a Rome that truly failed them. It had been reinforced by survival itself. The city's greatest strength had become its quietest vulnerability. That evening, as the sky darkened and the city prepared for rest, Rome carried the full weight of being eternal. It did not yet understand that eternity, once questioned, becomes a burden rather than a promise. And that belief, when it finally breaks, does so all at once. Warnings that did not sound like warnings. The warnings arrived quietly, as most truths do when no one is prepared to hear them. They did not come as alarms. There were no desperate cries at the gates, no messengers riding through the streets with urgency in their voices. Instead, the information drifted in slowly, wrapped in the language of routine and distance. Travelers spoke of movement beyond the city, not invasion movement. Groups gathering, roads becoming less safe, familiar routes growing uncertain. These accounts were shared in inns, at markets, in the pauses between bargaining and farewell. They sounded like the kinds of stories travelers always told, exaggerated, inconsistent, shaped by fatigue and fear rather than precision. Officials received reports. They were written carefully, cautiously, stripped of emotion. The words chosen were measured, designed not to provoke reaction, but to document possibility. Terms like pressure, instability, negotiation. Nothing that demanded immediate response. Nothing that suggested finality. Rome was accustomed to this tone. The empire's borders had been restless for decades. News of unrest no longer carried novelty. Each warning joined a long line of others that had failed to become catastrophe. The city had learned to listen without responding. Even the name of the enemy felt distant. The Visigoths were spoken of as an idea rather than a presence. A people, not a force. Something external, abstract, existing beyond the walls of Rome's daily experience. They belonged to maps and rumors, not streets and homes. Distance softened danger. What could not be seen did not require imagination. What did not interrupt routine could be postponed. Rome excelled at postponement. It had turned delay into policy and patience into principle. Some noticed the change in tone, the absence of reassurance, the way reports stopped promising resolution, the way words like soon and temporary began to disappear. These shifts were subtle, easily dismissed by those who did not wish to dwell on them. Others chose not to listen at all. They had learned that attention carried cost. To acknowledge warning was to invite responsibility, and responsibility demanded action. It was easier to trust that someone else would decide when urgency was necessary. Authority did not correct this assumption. There was no decisive statement from above, no clear directive that transformed uncertainty into preparation. Silence from leadership reinforced the belief that silence itself was a form of control. Rome interpreted quiet as confidence. If the danger were real, surely someone would say so. If action were required, surely orders would come. The absence of command felt like reassurance, not failure. The city continued its evenings. The warnings were absorbed, diluted, and forgotten as quickly as they arrived. They settled into the background noise of an empire that had grown used to hearing about trouble elsewhere. By the time the last light faded from the hills and the city fully surrendered to night, Rome had already heard enough to be afraid, but it had not heard enough to act. And so the warnings passed through the city without changing it, leaving behind only a faint sense of discomfort that would later be remembered, not as a call ignored, but as something that never truly sounded at all. Oh, the waiting without alarm. Addizione. The enemy that was still a word. To most of Rome, the enemy did not yet exist. It existed only as language. The word barbarian carried no immediacy. It described distance, not danger. It belonged to the edges of maps, to places defined by their separation from Rome rather than their proximity to it. The Visigoths, when named at all, remained part of that distant category, something beyond the horizon, contained by geography and time. Words softened reality. They allowed threat to remain abstract, manageable, theoretical. An enemy described in general terms could not interrupt a life. It could be acknowledged and set aside, discussed briefly, and then forgotten in favor of what demanded attention now. Rome had grown comfortable with abstraction. For decades, the empire had negotiated with forces it once would have crushed. Treaties replaced triumphs. Payments replaced conquest. The language of accommodation reshaped how danger was understood. Enemies became partners, federati, interests to be managed. This vocabulary dulled instinct. When danger wears the mask of diplomacy, It no longer triggers alarm. Rome had learned to believe that words could substitute for walls, that agreements could hold where legions once stood. The habit of survival shifted from preparation to conversation. Even fear adjusted. It became distant, academic, discussed rather than felt. A matter for councils and scribes, not households and streets. The enemy was something to be addressed later, somewhere else, by someone authorized to do so. People continued their days unchanged. Markets opened, disputes were settled, worship proceeded. The city did not rehearse defense, it rehearsed continuity. The absence of visible threat reinforced the belief that none existed. Those few who imagined otherwise found no language to convince others. How does one argue against a word? How does one transform a rumor into urgency when nothing has yet crossed the threshold of experience? Without evidence, imagination sounds like fear. Fear sounds like weakness. Rome dismissed weakness. Its identity had been built on resilience. To admit vulnerability before it became undeniable felt like betrayal of that identity. The city preferred to trust its name rather than its senses. And so the enemy remained a word, spoken, recorded, debated, but not believed. By the time that word would acquire form, movement, and consequence, Rome would already have spent too long waiting for language to do what action no longer could. A city that had learned to endure. Endurance was Rome's most practiced skill. It had been learned slowly over centuries of disruption that never quite reached finality. Each crisis had trained the city to absorb shock without transforming itself. Hardship came, hardship passed, and Rome remained. This pattern shaped expectation more powerfully than any decree. People measured danger by memory. They compared present uncertainty to past survival. If the city had endured worse, and it had then, whatever approached now, would be folded into the same long tradition of persistence. Endurance became reassurance. This was not optimism, it was habit. Rome had endured emperors who ruled briefly and poorly. It had endured civil wars that turned streets into battlegrounds. It had endured plagues that emptied neighborhoods and famine that made hunger familiar. Through it all, the city continued to function, altered but intact. Functioning became the goal, not victory, not reform, simply continuity. As long as daily life proceeded, the city considered itself successful. Crisis was something to outlast, not confront. This mindset shaped preparation or the lack of it. Why mobilize when endurance had always sufficed? Why disrupt routines when routines themselves were proof of survival? Rome had learned that stability could be maintained by refusing to acknowledge instability. People adapted quietly. They stored a little extra food. They avoided certain roads. They listened more carefully to rumors without acting on them. These small adjustments felt sufficient. They preserved normality without demanding sacrifice. Leadership mirrored this behavior. There was no call to arms, no visible reinforcement of defenses, no public acknowledgement that the city stood at risk. The absence of instruction allowed endurance to masquerade as strategy. Rome waited. Not in fear, but in expectation that waiting itself would resolve what action might complicate. Time had always been Rome's ally. Why assume it had turned against the city now? Even those who sensed unease struggled to imagine consequence. Endurance had removed the concept of finality from the city's thinking. Nothing in Rome's experience truly ended. Things changed, declined, recovered, but did not collapse entirely. That belief was comforting. It allowed people to go to sleep without dread. It allowed the city to move forward without decision. It transformed danger into background noise. And yet endurance has limits. Rome had learned how to endure hardship, but it had forgotten how to recognize the moment when endurance ceases to be enough. That moment was approaching quietly, and Rome, practiced in survival, did not notice the difference between waiting and surrender. The waiting without alarm. Silence in the places where orders used to come from. The silence was not sudden. It settled gradually like dust, accumulating in spaces that once echoed with certainty. Rome had grown used to commands clear, authoritative, unmistakable. Even when those commands were flawed, they had carried the reassurance of direction. Now direction faded. Messages arrived without urgency, if they arrived at all. Decisions were delayed, reframed, or passed elsewhere. Authority existed, but it no longer spoke with a single voice. Responsibility dissolved into committees, envoys, negotiations that stretched time thin. People noticed the absence before they understood it. They felt it in the lack of announcements, in the way officials avoided firm statements, in the quiet deflection of questions that once would have been answered directly. Silence filled the gaps where orders should have been. This absence created a dangerous calm. Without instruction, citizens assumed that instruction was unnecessary. The logic felt natural. If nothing was said, then nothing required action. Silence became reassurance, not warning. Rome had been conditioned to trust structure. As long as offices remained occupied, as long as rituals of governance continued, the city believed control persisted. The forms of authority were still present, even if their substance had thinned. The city mistook form for function. Those closest to power understood the fragility more clearly. They sensed the hesitation behind official language, the careful avoidance of commitment. They recognized the signs of uncertainty, but recognition did not translate into leadership. To speak decisively would be to accept responsibility for outcomes no one could guarantee, and so no one spoke. The silence protected individuals at the expense of the city. It allowed delay to masquerade as caution. It preserved personal safety while eroding collective security. Rome adapted again. People stopped expecting guidance. They learned to interpret silence as normal. Life continued without coordination, each household relying on its own judgment, its own limits. This fragmentation went largely unnoticed. The city still appeared whole. Streets remained open, markets functioned, worship continued. But beneath this continuity, Rome had lost something essential, the ability to act together. When the moment arrived that demanded decision, the city would discover that silence had already made the decision for it, and that what felt like calm had, all along, been abandonment. Well, the night the gates were opened, Trumainonum, because the night did not arrive with thunder. There were no horns at the walls, no sudden rush of feet, no cry that tore sleep from the city. Rome passed into darkness the way it always did. Lamps lit, voices lowered, doors closed with familiar sounds. If anyone sensed that this night differed from others, the feeling remained unspoken. The gates were still there, massive, weathered, scarred by centuries of use and neglect. They had been opened and closed more times than anyone living could remember. Their presence suggested security through longevity. A thing so old felt permanent simply by having survived. No order came to reinforce them. No additional guards appeared. No preparations altered their rhythm. The mechanisms of defense existed, but they were unattended by urgency. The gates stood as symbols rather than barriers, objects that implied protection without actively providing it. Outside the walls, movement continued, quietly, methodically. not as an assault, but as approach. The absence of resistance shaped behavior. Where resistance is expected, there is tension. Where none appears, there is calculation. The city's stillness signaled opportunity without confrontation. Inside, Rome slept unevenly. Some slept deeply, untroubled. Others woke briefly, unsettled by nothing they could name. A sound carried too far. A silence lingered too long. These moments passed without interpretation. Night often unsettles the mind. No one treated unease as evidence. The gates were opened without drama. No single moment marked the transition. There was no sound that later generations could point to and say, that is when it happened. Entry unfolded as continuation, one movement, following another step by step, without urgency. Rome did not witness its own crossing. Those who might have seen did not understand what they were seeing. Those who understood were not positioned to warn. The city's defenses failed not because they were broken, but because they were no longer imagined as necessary. This was the city's quietest defeat, not forced, not contested, simply accepted by absence of opposition. Rome's greatest protection, its reputation, had convinced it that protection itself was optional. By the time the gates stood open to the night, the city's fate had already moved beyond prevention. What followed would not arrive as invasion, it would arrive as presence. These streets without defenders. The streets did not change at once. They looked as they always had in the deep hours of night, narrow, uneven, shaped by centuries of passage. Stone held the day's warmth. Doorways lay in shadow. Corners concealed nothing more dangerous than darkness itself. At first glance, Rome appeared intact, unchanged by what had already begun. But something was missing. There were no patrols, no familiar presence of men whose purpose was to be seen, to remind the city that someone watched while others slept. No clatter of armor, no measured pace echoing between walls. The streets belonged to no one. This absence was subtle. Rome had not always relied on visible defense. In quieter years, patrols had grown less frequent, more symbolic than practical. Their disappearance did not immediately register as danger. It felt like another small concession to fatigue, another sign that the city had learned to trust itself. Yet absence alters space. Without defenders, streets lose direction. They become corridors rather than boundaries, paths rather than protections. The city's interior, once organized around centers of authority, flattened into accessibility. Those who entered noticed this immediately. Movement met no resistance. Progress required no confrontation. Streets guided rather than challenged. Rome's interior revealed itself without argument, offering routes to its heart as though it had forgotten the meaning of concealment. Within homes, people stirred, not fully awake, not fully at rest. Some sensed unfamiliar movement, footsteps that did not belong, pauses where none should be. But these impressions arrived without clarity. Night transforms perception. The mind hesitates to trust itself in darkness. Fear requires confirmation. Without shouts, without alarms, without visible threat, suspicion dissolved into uncertainty. Uncertainty, in turn, returned to sleep. Doors remained closed. Windows stayed dark. The city did not rise to meet what moved through it. Rome had been taught that danger announces itself. That lesson proved fatal. What entered the city did so without invitation, but also without challenge. The absence of defenders did not provoke alarm, because alarm had been conditioned to wait for noise. By the time fear found language, it would already be too late to give it purpose. The streets accepted what moved through them, and Rome, unguarded, continued to sleep. A city watching itself be entered. Rome did not wake all at once. It became aware in fragments. A door opening where no door should open, a footstep that paused too long in the street below, the faint sound of voices that did not carry the rhythms of neighbors or guards. These moments reached individuals separately, without coordination, without confirmation. People rose quietly, not in alarm but in confusion. Curtains were drawn back just enough to see without being seen. From upper rooms, figures leaned toward narrow windows, careful not to cast silhouettes into the street. What they observed did not resemble invasion as they had imagined it. There was no rush. Those moving through the city did not behave like an army. They did not shout. They did not strike at once. They walked, looked, assessed. They treated the city not as an obstacle to overcome, but as a place already open to them. This unsettled the witnesses more than violence would have. Violence clarifies roles. It tells people when to hide, when to flee, when to resist. Quiet presence offers no instruction. It leaves the observer suspended between interpretation and disbelief. Some recognized what they were seeing. They knew the shapes of unfamiliar armor, the way unfamiliar groups move when they expect no resistance. But recognition did not bring authority. There was no one to warn, no command to follow, no collective response to join. Others convinced themselves it was temporary, a patrol passing through, an escort for negotiations, another compromise, another arrangement beyond the understanding of ordinary citizens. Rome had learned to explain away disruption rather than confront it. The city watched itself being entered, not as a single body, but as thousands of isolated witnesses, each seeing only a piece, none certain that their piece mattered. Without shared awareness, fear remained private. Private fear does not mobilize. In some quarters, doors were barred more tightly. In others, people froze where they stood, unwilling to move lest movement attract attention. A few attempted to leave, only to retreat again when the unfamiliar presence made escape feel more dangerous than hiding. The streets filled slowly, unevenly, not with defenders, but with watchers, eyes behind shutters, breathing held in darkness. Rome observed its own transformation without understanding its meaning. This was not the fall Rome had been taught to imagine. There were no walls collapsing, no cries of victory or defeat. What unfolded was quieter, more intimate, and far more devastating. The city's power had relied on its ability to command space. That ability was gone. Rome did not lose itself in a moment of destruction. It lost itself in the moment it realized it could only watch. 3 days that changed everything. Destruction without hatred. What followed did not look like vengeance. There was no frenzy in it, no fury that burned itself out in moments of excess. The destruction unfolded with a measured patience that unsettled those who witnessed it. Rome had prepared itself, at least in legend, for enemies who hated it. What it encountered instead was something colder. The taking began quietly. Doors were opened not by force alone, but by assessment. Locks tested, weight applied where hinges were weakest. The work was methodical, almost careful. What could be carried was carried. What resisted was broken only as much as necessary. There was little shouting. Commands were spoken low, passed from one figure to another without urgency. The city was treated not as an adversary, but as a resource of vast, exhausted, and undefended. Violence occurred, but it was not indiscriminate. It was applied when needed, withheld when not. This restraint confused the city. People had imagined terror as chaos. They had imagined screams, fires, streets running with panic. Instead, fear arrived through uncertainty, through the knowledge that nothing predictable governed what was happening, that mercy and cruelty followed no visible pattern. Temples were entered, not stormed, but opened. Sacred spaces that had stood inviolate through centuries were crossed with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. Statues were examined, not worshipped or destroyed out of spite. Offerings were taken, treasures removed. The meaning of the place mattered less than its contents. Homes fared no better. The distinction between public and private dissolved. Rooms that had never known strangers were entered by strangers who showed neither reverence nor hostility, only intent. Some occupants were ignored. Others were displaced. The absence of hatred made resistance feel pointless. Hatred invites defiance. This did not. What Rome experienced was not punishment, but extraction. The city was being emptied of what made it itself wealth, authority, sanctity without ceremony. The process felt less like conquest and more like dismantling. Time lost shape. Hours blurred into one another. Night and day ceased to matter. People marked passing moments not by light, but by the sound of footsteps outside their doors, by the return or absence of familiar faces. Rome endured, as it always had, but endurance offered no comfort now. It did not promise recovery. It did not suggest survival as triumph. It merely prolonged awareness. The city began to understand that this destruction did not need hatred to be complete. It only needed time. The collapse of meaning. The damage went deeper than stone and gold. As the days passed, Rome began to lose not only what it possessed, but what those possessions had meant. Objects survived, but their significance drained away. Symbols remained standing, yet they no longer spoke with authority. Temples were still recognizable. Columns stood. Altars remained where they had always been. But the invisible boundary that had once separated sacred space from the ordinary world had dissolved. What had required permission now required none. What had demanded reverence now inspired only appraisal. This change unsettled people more than loss itself. Rome had endured theft before. It had endured sacrilege, even destruction. But meaning had always been restored afterward, repaired through ritual, explanation, decree. Now there was no language left to do that work. The gods felt distant, not defeated, simply absent. Prayers continued, but they echoed strangely, as if spoken into rooms that no longer recognized their purpose. The city did not accuse its gods of failure. It did something more dangerous. It stopped expecting response. Public spaces emptied. Forums that once structured debate and identity became corridors of passage, crossed quickly without gathering. Words felt less reliable. Declarations carried no weight when no authority remained to enforce them. Even law grew uncertain. Rules still existed, written and remembered, but they lacked consequence. Justice depends on belief that outcomes matter, that structure holds. In Rome, structure had become fragile. The law remained visible, but its foundation had cracked. Families retreated inward, meaning narrowed to survival, to protecting what little remained, to waiting for an end that refused to announce itself clearly. Conversation shortened. Memory focused on what had been lost rather than what might return. The city had always understood itself through continuity, through the idea that what mattered today would matter tomorrow and the day after that. That assumption no longer held. Rome had not been destroyed physically. It had been disconnected from its future. This was the true collapse, not the breaking of walls, but the breaking of narrative. Rome could no longer explain itself to itself. The stories that had justified endurance fell silent, one by one. What remained was presence without purpose, a city still standing, but unsure why it should. Even when the city was still standing, but Rome was gone. When the movement finally slowed, the city did not collapse. That was what surprised those who had expected an ending that looked like ruin. Buildings remained upright. Streets were still passable. The familiar outlines of Rome endured, almost stubbornly unchanged. From a distance, the city could have been mistaken for itself, but something essential had withdrawn. What people felt upon stepping back into the streets was not relief, it was disorientation. The city no longer answered to its own image. Landmarks that had once anchored identity now felt hollow, like markers left behind by something that had moved on. Rome had always been more than stone. Its power had lived in assumption and the belief that it was the center toward which everything else oriented itself. That belief had ordered behavior, justified obedience, and shaped meaning. Now it no longer functioned. People moved differently. They avoided gathering. They avoided eye contact. Conversations were brief, cautious, unfinished. The unspoken understanding was that nothing could be assumed anymore. Not safety, not order, not continuity. Authority did not reassert itself. There were no declarations that restored confidence. No gestures large enough to repair what had been undone. The mechanisms of control still existed in form, but they lacked conviction. Rome could no longer command belief, only compliance, and even that weakened by the hour. The city had survived, but survival no longer carried pride. It felt accidental rather than earned. Rome had not prevailed, it had simply been left behind. This distinction mattered. A city that survives a siege can rebuild its narrative around resilience. A city that is bypassed by history cannot. Rome had not been destroyed because it was no longer necessary to destroy it. The idea of Rome had already passed elsewhere. What remained was a place filled with memory, but stripped of inevitability. A city that would continue to exist, but never again as the unquestioned measure of the world. The people sensed this instinctively. They did not say that Rome was gone. They said nothing at all. Language struggled to keep pace with the shift. Silence returned, heavier now, carrying the weight of recognition. Rome still stood, but it no longer knew what it stood for. In epilogue, after Rome. News that broke the world. The news did not travel quickly. It moved along the same roads that had once carried Rome's authority outward, now burdened with disbelief rather than command. Messengers hesitated. Words were chosen carefully, rewritten, softened, then spoken anyway, because silence could no longer contain what had happened. When people first heard it, they did not understand. Rome had been entered. Rome had been taken. Rome had been violated. The statement sounded unreal, like fragments torn from a story told incorrectly. Listeners waited for clarification that never arrived. They asked for details that contradicted one another. Surely this was exaggeration. Surely this was rumor. But repetition hardened disbelief into shock. The same words reached different cities from different directions. Travelers confirmed what messengers tried to minimize. Letters arrived bearing seals that no longer reassured. The story stabilized, not because it became clearer, but because it refused to go away. The world had been oriented around Rome, not simply politically, but conceptually. Rome was the reference point against which order was measured. To say that Rome had fallen was to suggest that nothing stood where certainty had once been. Communities reacted unevenly. Some panicked, seeing in Rome's fate their own future. Others denied it, clinging to the belief that if Rome still stood physically, then Rome still existed in essence. Many fell silent, unsure what response was appropriate when history itself appeared to hesitate. Leaders struggled for language. There was no precedent for this kind of loss. Previous defeats could be framed as temporary, recoverable. This was different. Rome had not been replaced. It had not been conquered in a way that suggested succession. It had simply ceased to function as the center. The news did not call people to arms. It called them to reconsideration, to a slow, unsettling awareness that the structures they relied on might no longer protect them, not because they had failed, but because they no longer mattered. The shock spread outward, not as fear alone, but as disorientation. The world did not collapse in response to Rome's fall. It drifted. Connections weakened. Assumptions loosened. What had once been guaranteed by Rome's existence now required negotiation. History shifted its weight. The news did not end an era in a single moment. It initiated a long unraveling. Rome's fall became a reference point not for destruction, but for uncertainty. The world learned that night that permanence could be entered quietly, and once entered, it could never fully be restored. The beginning of a different age. What followed did not resemble a beginning. There were no declarations announcing a new era, no ceremonies marking transition. The world moved forward without understanding that it had crossed a threshold. The age that emerged did so quietly, without agreement or design. Rome's absence created space, not immediately and not evenly. For a time, the outlines of the old world remained in place. Titles were still used. Offices still existed. Laws were still cited, but the authority behind them no longer reached as far as it once had. Power fragmented, not through rebellion, but through necessity. Local rule strengthened by default. Communities that had once deferred to Rome began to rely on proximity rather than prestige. Decisions were made closer to home, shaped by immediate concerns rather than imperial vision. This shift was practical, not ideological. Survival demanded responsiveness, not loyalty. Memory replaced direction. People looked backward more often than forward. They referenced Rome not as a living force, but as a measure of loss. The past became a source of legitimacy, even as it ceased to offer guidance. Tradition lingered without infrastructure to support it. Trade altered its paths. Routes once maintained by Rome's authority weakened or disappeared. Exchange continued, but less predictably, shaped by risk and opportunity rather than policy. The world became uneven connected in places, isolated in others. Security followed the same pattern. Protection depended on relationships rather than systems. Allegiances shifted, trust narrowed. The broad impersonal stability Rome had provided was replaced by smaller, more fragile arrangements. This transformation did not feel like progress. It felt like adaptation. People adjusted without naming what they were adjusting to. They learned to live in a world where no single city guaranteed order, where certainty had to be earned repeatedly rather than assumed. Rome's fall did not end civilization. It changed its rhythm. The age that followed would be marked not by uniformity, but by variation, by local power, uneven knowledge, and the slow rebuilding of meaning from fragments rather than foundations. History did not announce this shift. It allowed it to happen. The night that never truly ended. The night did not remain confined to the moment it occurred. It extended itself forward, quietly, into years and centuries that would struggle to explain what had been lost. What happened to Rome in that darkness did not conclude with departure or recovery. It settled into the structure of the world that followed. Rome continued to exist. People lived there, prayed there, worked, argued, rebuilt. The city did not vanish from maps or memory, but something irretrievable had shifted. Rome no longer stood as a guarantee. It had become an example. The night taught a lesson that history would repeat, that power does not always fall through confrontation, that certainty can erode without resistance, that a world may continue functioning long after its center has lost meaning. Those who lived through it rarely spoke of that night as an ending. They spoke of before and after, of how things used to feel, of how confidence once required no explanation. The absence of that confidence was difficult to describe, but easy to recognize. Later generations would search for the moment Rome fell. They would debate dates, causes, responsibility. They would look for a single blow, a decisive failure, a moment dramatic enough to carry the weight of collapse. What they would find instead was something quieter, a city that believed too long in what it had been, a world that mistook endurance for permanence, a night that did not destroy Rome, but revealed that Rome had already begun to disappear. That night never truly ended because its consequences did not. It lived on in fragmentation, in uncertainty, in the knowledge that no structure, no matter how ancient, is immune to becoming hollow before it falls. And long after the streets of Rome returned to familiar rhythms, long after its stones were walked by new generations who never knew the empire, the world carried forward the understanding born in that darkness, that history does not always announce its turning points. Sometimes it simply lets a city fall asleep, believing it is still eternal.